Does it look like they can save any of the buildings?
Doesn't look like it to me, but
they were covering one of the biggest stories at the time.
The Old Main fire was such an event, people wanted to memorialize it.
Losing Old Main was catastrophic more for sentiment, I guess, than anything, because it had been with us always. It was our symbol.
Hey Salukis, welcome to another episode of Saluki Sleuths. This time, we're digging into one of the most infamous moments in SIU history, the day Old Main burned. Old Main was once a flagship building here on campus, located in the area where I'm standing now. Old Main may be gone, but the story behind it is Saluki legend.
Bill Livingston and John Hollerick are two students who have been on the scene for the better part of the day.
The Salukis who saw it will never forget. Flames tearing through historic architecture, the smoke billowing over campus, the hundreds of students who ran into a burning building to save pieces of SIU history.
I think it's fantastic. I came just as students started carrying out, and these kids were going in the smoke and fire and pulling out file cases and stuff out of the museum.
The Morris Library Special Collections Department preserved this TV news footage from the day Old Main burned, June 8th, 1969.
I've talked to a lot of firemen. They said without the students they couldn't have saved anything. They couldn't even have manned the hoses. And the students, from what I've heard from President Morris, a few other people, that they've got everything out that was of any value.
As the fire was quite well along and the ceiling of the third floor had fallen onto the ceiling of the second.
On that day, more than 400 SIU students formed a makeshift brigade to put out the fire. They chopped down trees, they hauled fire hoses, and they created human chains that carried museum artifacts, office equipment, and term papers from inside Old Main to the safety outside.
The man I saw standing on top of a snorkel with smoke so thick you could just see it billowing around him, and similar acts, both by the firemen and students, makes you appreciate the spirit that people put forth when they're faced with a crisis like this.
Old Main was a total loss. Not everything could be saved. Tens of thousands of dollars in equipment, artifacts, and more were lost in the fire. That would be millions in today's dollars. Firefighters who responded to the scene remember feeling overwhelmed. Their trucks and ladders couldn't reach the area where the fire was burning hardest.
We had more fire than we could handle at the time. Fire spread very rapidly through the attic, then to the third floor.
Old Main had been the symbolic heart of SIU. It was home to offices for the English and history departments, foreign languages, teaching labs, classrooms, and the university museum. There's evidence the Old Main fire was no accident. The building was also home to the ROTC department, a program facing criticism and scrutiny in the late 1960s when sentiment about the Vietnam War was extremely low. Firefighters found rags coated with accelerants that were strategically placed in stairways to prevent fire crews from reaching the top floors.
My name is Rod Spaw. I live now in Bloomington, Indiana. From 2000 to 2003, I was a graduate student at SIU.
Rod Spaw is a former SIU student and newspaper reporter who researched the turbulent late 60s at SIU as part of a graduate school project. Part of his project focused on the investigation into the Old Main fire.
I looked for a while for the State Fire Marshal's report because I thought that might have some clues in it, but it had been too long, and the Illinois State Archives didn't keep things that, this was almost 40 years after the fact.
Spaw interviewed more than a dozen student journalists and SIU faculty members about the Old Main fire.
Because they were covering one of the biggest stories at the time from their perspective as students and also prospective journalists.
Old Main burned during a time of significant social unrest, not just in Carbondale, but all over the country. The late 1960s were difficult. Americans learned how bad things really were in Vietnam after the Tet Offensive. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, and so had Robert Kennedy. Protests on campus were not uncommon.
It was a volatile period. That was when things kind of got more serious.
According to SPA's reporting, just 1 month before Old Main burned, a dinner celebrating Delight Morris's 20th anniversary as SIU's president was disrupted by about 100 protesters.
I guess the most serious thing in '68 on May 7th, someone set off a bomb in the agricultural building. Late at night, nobody was injured, but it blew out all the doors and windows for a whole corridor.
SPA's research on Old Main expanded to FBI involvement in Carbondale during the late 1960s. He submitted a Freedom of Information request for details on the monitoring of student dissent at SIU.
I got 1,100 pages of internal FBI documents that covered that period. I was kind of surprised the FBI had case files. I looked that up. What they called case files were when they would identify someone they wanted to follow, and they would have a folder with a number on it and a name, and that was your case file.
SPA says local authorities described the Old Main fire as arson. However, no suspect was ever charged or publicly identified. Evidence that might have helped prove guilt was destroyed in the fire.
And then, of course, there was the famous message found on the blackboard, which was piss on Old Main is burning. So it all points to somebody that had a grudge of some sort.
The circumstances surrounding the Old Main fire may have been tense, but how students handled it was heroic. They saved hundreds of artifacts, documents, and items from the University Museum. Many of these precious pieces of SIU history have been discovered all over Carbondale. To this day, many people still find Old Main artifacts in their gardens or backyards.
When Old Main burned, everybody wanted a piece of it. So a lot of people, I think, kind of absconded with some pieces that they used and loved. They wanted to make sure they came back here, so we ended up with them again. But you can see that people made memorial pieces out of the salvaged bits of Old Main.
Susanna Munson is a curator with the Sharp Museum on campus. She and Eric Jones with Property Control show us the Old Main artifacts that are preserved in the museum collection.
In our permanent collection at the Sharp Museum, we have a lot of remnants of Old Main. You can see here there's some architectural decorative pieces with leaves and these copper domes.
Losing Old Main was catastrophic more for sentiment, I guess, than anything, because it had been with us always. It was our symbol, and it's on a lot of things even today. It's old stationery, sometimes it's on a pin or whatever. And people felt that it was important. It was the symbol, the heart of what was going on here.
Eric Jones has done extensive research on the architecture and construction of Old Main. Relics from the building can also be found all over campus if you look closely.
We're in a courtyard next to Morris Library, and we're about to look at some Old Main remnants that were brought in a few years ago and set up this special courtyard. Here's the original cornerstone from the first main building from 1870. It's made out of Bosquedale red sandstone quarried just 4 miles south of here.
Pieces of Old Main have been skillfully woven into the fabric of other pieces of SIU architecture, including statues students pass by every day.
This is stone saved from after the fire of 1969.
Brian Gorecki worked at SIU as an architect for 30 years and was involved in several projects that reused pieces of Old Main in modern architecture, including the basin around the Paul and Virginia fountain. The fountain sculpture there today is a replica of the original that just barely survived the flames during the Old Main fire.
We were able to find, with the help of many people, find the artifacts that are stored on campus still in the area we like to call the boneyard. And we were able to reclaim, take out of the what is now a wooded area, a lot of those artifacts and put them on display to help educate people on the history of Old Main. There was an occasion also where we were able to make use of some of the terracotta architectural features that were salvaged from Old Main on campus. One is relatively close to where we're standing. There's a brick wall outside of the Allen building, which some of you know is right next to Shryock. the physical plant restored a retaining wall there, and we had our mason inlay a couple pieces of terracotta.
Eric Jones describes Old Main as one of the most unique designs in SIU's history. What some people may not know is that SIU constructed 2 buildings known as Old Main, and both of them burned. The first Old Main, also called the Normal Building, was built in 1874. It burned down just 9 years after construction in 1883.
Old Main arrived as the beginning of everything that is SIU today. It grew out of a post-Civil War movement to bring higher education to Southern Illinois in particular. And there was an act of legislature in 1869 that led to its founding.
The second Old Main Salukis today are more familiar with was built to replace it.
This is a big building. All the floors were, that little bottom floor that you almost don't notice, that's 16 feet tall, so that's double what a house would normally be. And other floors were over 20 feet tall, so stairways were just huge.
Some of the other features that the architect for Old Main incorporated were rounded arches as opposed to the more a pointed arch.
It's the symbolic heart of SIU so many alumni and supporters will never forget. Delight Morris said it best on the day Old Main burned.
To see a building that has been through 100 years of the school's history now being removed from it is going to be a wrenching experience for alumni and parents and friends of the university around the world, in fact, because of its sentimental value. And that you can't put a price on.
Well, that wraps up another episode of Saluki Sleuths. Thank you so much for joining us in remembering such an impactful moment in SIU history. We're grateful to the historians and journalists who contributed their research and made this episode possible. Thank you all so much for watching. And as always, go Dogs!